the entire time that the UK was in the EC and then the EU, there was a lot of general sort of ignorance, but also kind of apathy about the EU. For example, low voter turnouts in EU elections, people like Nigel Farage getting reelected time and time again, getting an EU pension now. So I just think the government can do a lot more to sort of up its game to ensure that there's a better understanding of the EU, that it's not undemocratic, that there are fewer EU bureaucrats than I think a number of city councils in the UK, things like that, because it seems that the and people like Boris Johnson were making things up about the EU that people chose to believe, and that all I think contributed to the situation that we're in.
Right. Now, I don't think you're going to like this, but I don't think that's the government's job. I think that's your job. Uh,
Yep, fair
as
point.
campaigners. And I say that, look, I was asked, I did some questions for an organisation during the election campaign. I was asked what I thought of the European movement's idea in the European Movement's manifesto for the government to conduct a survey on how Brexit had worked out. And I said, I don't support that. Why do I not support it? I don't think it would be respected as a
Right.
in the same way that I don't think pre 2016 the government's figures were respected. You need to find a body that is broadly respected. You need to find ways of saying, look, the UK did have influence before 2016, would have influence again if it was to rejoin. I don't see that the government is going to be the ones who are going to deliver that right now. Just being bluntly honest, so I think that this is where the next few years comes in. So the government can stabilise the relationship with the EU, and only the government can stabilise the relationship with the EU. That's not something that campaigners can do. So what's it? Campaigners, assuming you want to go further, you want to rejoin, you've got to make that case. And I think the case that you've got to make is the one in which the UK has that influence to actually shape things and make things happen. That's the story that was so rarely told beforehand.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, what's it going? Where we're going to get to in 3-5 years' time, I think, is the choice between the relationship as it has evolved, a kind of lighter touch Swiss model, basically, versus digging over everything again and going back in. I think that's going to be I think it's going to be an uphill struggle for those who would want to rejoin. I think that the status quo will be quite powerful. I'm not saying you can't do it, but I think I wouldn't underestimate the challenges of doing that. The desire that people maybe just won't want to go back there. So I don't think government's going to do it. I don't think government should do it. I think that's
Mm.
what I'm expecting to see from campaigning groups is right. These are the kind of core messages that we think would help persuade people to go back into the EU. We'll see. I'm just speaking from as in a role as a commentator. I'm not speaking as an advocate of any particular course of action.
When you travel in Europe, when you travel in continental Europe, you see your neighbors. You go to Vienna, you see the signs to Bratislava and Budapest. You go to Düsseldorf and you see the signs into Holland and Belgium. And in the UK, you don't necessarily until you get close enough to Dover. So, I do think it's something we need to think about very carefully, is to avoid a situation where it happens again, that people are misled, frankly, about the EU, what it is and how it works and what it's good for.
Towards the end, you were talking about the need for a maturing of the UK's attitude towards the EU. Would you like to kind of spell that out in a little more detail, David? We see quite a lot of this when we're doing our campaigning, but it would be good to have someone analyse it a little.
Well, I think what I believe by maturing is, are we going to have a government that is going to be honest about the choices that have to be made about the limitations, about the constraints. They're saying, look, if you're not going into the single market, you're not going to have frictionless trade. You are going to have trade barriers. That would be one example. That there are always going to be constraints, that we can't have everything that we want. That, for example, with regard to regulation, that it will probably be most straight, that there's no regulatory solution that means we can set our own regulations, but still mostly but have the sort of best of both worlds, where we have mostly our own regulations, but also we align, and also we get great access to the EU market. That choices have to be made in that sense, that we would have to choose. Do we want, do we want to align with the EU, or do we want to set our own regulations? And that is likely to be made at a sector by sector level. So it's issues like that where we want to see the maturing. I'm not sure how easy that will be. Getting into the habit of being honest about choices with regard to Brexit. That's going to go quite against what we've seen in recent years in the UK Brexit debate. So I'm not entirely confident that will happen, but I think slowly, hopefully, we will see some progress on that. But that's very much what I mean about the maturing, getting to the point where the UK government is a lot more honest on what the realistic choices are, on how different choices are going to lead to different outcomes.
So the one thing that I really picked up on was that you referred to the splitting on the EU's perspective as being, I believe the word you used was traumatic. And I was sort of interested in that you touched on that in the sense of how that impacted in the sort of short, and I suppose we're in the medium run now of UK-EU relations. But how would that splitting being seen from other countries who are outsiders to Europe, to the EU, how has that affected or not affected the perception of the UK on the wider international stage beyond just Europe?
Look, I don't speak to people from every country, but certainly there are some countries that were, particularly concerned and felt that they had to stage almost interventions to keep the UK on the straight and narrow. That they were seriously worried at various points that the UK was going to go off the rails and kind of denounce international law completely. So that was certainly the case. In general, I mean, you can certainly take it from, for example, the US business community. They still prioritize UK-EU ties over UK-US ties. Their argument being, look, we can trade between the US and the UK, but we always wanted to use the UK as a regional base for Europe. They were, again, many of them weren't impressed with the way things have gone. I don't think I can think of a country as a whole where where generally the government was supportive of the way the UK government was proceeding. There are some countries where some parts of the government, I mean, you can, the Australian opposition party, is probably quite favourable to Brexit. You can see elements of the Republicans are favourable to Brexit, but in general, countries did not see what the UK was doing in particularly favourable light. So that gives an opportunity for the new government to be seen in a better way. I don't think anymore. I don't think they would have a view on whether the UK should be members of the EU or not. I think their view would be that the UK should be behaving like a normal international country, not threatening to break treaty commitments that we've made, and doing our best to have strong relationships with our neighbours. So I think that's as far as it goes. But yeah, there's some way to make up, I think, for the UK government to be seen in that way.
You talked about the UK needing to properly implement, what's already been agreed. Did you have anything in mind beyond properly implementing import controls? Is there anything else but
Well, I
hasn't
think
been
the
implemented.
import controls are the main one. I think there are some other things. I don't know exactly what. Clearly, there continue to be issues with citizens' rights under the withdrawal agreement that are causing some concerns as well. But I think I think it has been mostly around the import checks. But I'm not absolutely certain that there's not plenty more out there. If you went to the EU, and certainly if I was the UK government, I would want to go to the EU and say, right, what do you think we are not implementing? Because we need to know all of that. But it's certainly something you hear quite a lot from EU sources. Oh, we've never implemented it fully. We know some bits. We don't know others. You really need to get that on the table.
I've not heard any mention of reconnecting the law enforcement to SIS2, a European communication system between all the police services and other law enforcement. And Gove had us disconnected from it, which seemed a very strange idea, but it was part of his celebration, presumably, of leaving the European Union. But our police forces found it exceedingly useful to know what was coming into the country, and surveillance could be put on criminals without them actually realizing what was going on.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question, and I think that where this comes in is that whenever I look at all of the different areas, I inevitably miss some. I'd forgotten about law enforcement database. I remember the debate before that we should be connected to various of those. There's been talk about being connected, for example, also to health and safety alerts, food alert systems, for example. There have been various conversations about lots of these different things, and I don't know if they're all written down anywhere. I've got an article open to read at the moment about linking in with health, about how we link in as well with things like clinical trials. There are so many of these things out there, and that nobody quite has a picture of all of them, and that's why the UK government the new UK government needs to get out of its head that it's going to be a single negotiation or renegotiation, and start trying to get the whole list of everything together and working out how it all fits into into the relationship. Which bits you can make progress on, which bits might take longer to do. I don't honestly think that any single person has that whole picture in their mind, but that's what the UK government needs to have. And then when it has that relationship in its mind, it needs to be thinking about the priorities. Right, what do we think we can do separately? What will departments be able to do? What links to what? Some of these may actually be low-hanging fruit, because quite possibly the EU wants the UK part of the system, and the UK wants to be part of the system, the new UK government. So there will be things that will be relatively straightforward, and then there will be things where there's not such a meeting of minds, and things will have to be discussed. But at the moment, I'm afraid I don't have a full picture of everything. I certainly don't know about law enforcement databases personally. But it doesn't surprise me. I remember them being there, and there's they're just one example of many.
Do you think the government know that they don't know all this? Do you think, are they alert to it?
Well, I mean, we don't know enough about how the government has evolved in its structures and individuals since the end of TCA negotiations, at which point there would have been officials who would have had a broad picture. Now, the suggestion is that team got sort of split up, and we don't have such a picture anymore. And so, quite possibly, the government does need to rebuild that picture, to rebuild that understanding. Ideally, as well, to rebuild it with a certain extent, with a little bit of public awareness, because, to be honest, the levels of expertise vary, and there will be stakeholder groups, and some people will, if you make that relatively publicly available, there will be groups who are able to say, look, we can do things on this area, we can't do things on this area. You almost crowdsource wisdom on some of these different subjects. So they'll be aware of, I'm sure government or officials will be aware of a lot of it. They won't necessarily be aware of all of it, and it won't necessarily be held in a single place. So I'm quite sure that there is work to be done to make sure that that's in place.
John asked the question, is any progress likely on touring in the EU by musicians and musical groups?
And my understanding is yes, because I think that there is interest on both sides in doing so. I don't know exactly what. There already has been some progress of doing it at a member state level. What I think the caution would be is how that links into EU asks around youth mobility. So you could definitely see a mobility package being put together that has something on youth mobility, has something on touring artists, and other interests that both sides have. I'm not quite sure where we are. Well, again, we're 10 days in, so I wouldn't expect that to be decided yet. It will be more a case of, right, are we having a mobility package like that? How are we going to handle the EU asks on youth mobility, not all of which would be straightforward for the UK to handle? So I don't think we're quite there in knowing how we would how that's going to be delivered, but I think I'm expecting that there will be progress.